Welcome back, everyone, and thanks again for being here. We're going to shift gears for a minute for you all. This panel is about the cyber threat landscape, preparation, and remediation, which has become a big area for a lot of attorneys to provide counsel for. And we have really a terrific panel here. Very excited. A couple first timers. Let's start off with our moderator, Sunil Shenoi. He's a partner in the Government and Internal Investigations Group at Kirkland and Ellis, where he focuses his practice on advising clients on data security and data privacy matters and incident response. But what you may miss about Sunil is what makes him different from just about every lawyer you heard from today so far. And that's Sunil cut his cyber teeth as a consultant first at Capgemini and at Deloitte, before becoming a partner at Kirkland. Now, we all know the secret to any great IR success for every lawyer is to hire the right team of experts and technologists to perform the critical IR tasks of digital forensics, malware reverse engineering, remediation, the list goes on. So Sunil's experience makes him one of the best at bridging the gap between lawyer and technologist. For instance, figuring out how to handle one of the biggest hot button issues these days in IR, which is what? Attorney-client privilege and forensic investigations, where we all have some very strong views and oftentimes have diverging opinions on best practices. Because he successfully navigates the generation gap between technologists and lawyers, probably better than anyone, Sunil's theme song has to be Like a Bridge Over Troubled Waters by Simon and Garfunkel, because Sunil is always the solution and never the problem. So welcome, Sunil.
Thank you very much, John. Happy to be here.
Great. Next up is Craig Hoffman, the epitome of the seasoned IR veteran, the co-leader of the digital risk advisory and cybersecurity team at the mega incident response firm of BakerHostetler. His numbers are insane. He has led over 200 entities through payment card security incidents, PCI, and the exhaustive PCI DSS revalidation process and payment card network liability assessments that follow, that are inevitable, that you have to pay for yourself. Whatever the industry, retail, restaurant, hospitality, financial services, Craig is in the mix. He's also someone who can lead securities firms in red team exercises, penetration tests, compromise assessments, security risk assessments, cybersecurity maturing assessments, which is why he's perfect for this panel. This is all part of basic cyber hygiene nowadays and pretty much expected by regulators of every kind of company. Because Craig takes on all comers, his theme song has got to be Not Afraid, because Craig Hoffman is a bona fide pioneer and the Eminem of incident response. Welcome, Craig. And next up is Michael Sussmann, my old friend Michael Sussmann, and one of an elite cadre of national security and cyber lawyers here in DC, practicing now at Fenwick as a privacy and data security partner. I go way back with Michael. We first met about 30 years ago, and later collaborated when he was at DOJ as special counsel to the Attorney General, where he was doing pioneering work, drafting first of their kind guidelines and manuals for prosecuting computer crimes, for searching and seizing computers and obtaining electronic evidence in criminal investigations, and prosecuting intellectual property crimes, navigating the labyrinth of these old regulations which involve technology and sort of integrating them into the new age of cyber. He would later join CSIP's, the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section at DOJ, where he combined this national security experience with cyber, and then he went out to join the private sector. As I said before, like Craig, he's really another true pioneer in the area of cyber, and we are thrilled to have him here. Without getting into the details, suffices to say that Michael Sussmann wins the prize for being the toughest lawyer at this conference by far, and he is the Rocky Balboa of incident response. And given Michael's track record, one tune stands out that would make a perfect fit for his theme song, and that's Winning by Carlos Santana, because Michael Sussmann is a winner no matter who he meets in battle. And welcome, old friend. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, John. It's very nice. Thanks.
And finally, our last speaker is new to the IR Forum Masterclass, Monsurat Ottun. She is a cybersecurity advisor at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, where she tackles cybersecurity issues on a national level. She has the usual impressive list of certifications and training, but what makes her background so different from everyone here is that Monsurat started out locally in the Providence, Rhode Island City Solicitor's Office as a local DA. and she worked as an assistant city solicitor and was then promoted to an associate city solicitor and then became the city's chief information security officer and data privacy and risk management strategist. And she became responsible for leading the city's cybersecurity program initiatives. You gotta love that background. In Providence, Monsurat created and now led the Providence Information Security Advisory Council to support the city's mission to promote cyber defense and good cyber hygiene. I love this quote I found from Monsurat from a few years ago. Technology will impact every aspect of our lives. There won't be one industry or sector that isn't touched by AI, the Internet of Things, and virtual or augmented reality. It's important to consider the protections we have in place to secure our data, remove the biases that we implicitly transfer over to our technology, and contemplate the ever-evolving idea of privacy. As a lawyer and cybersecurity strategist, it's my role to anticipate the consequences of these changes and manage the risks through planning and mitigation techniques. If Monsurat had a theme song, I think it would be On Top of the World by Imagine Dragons, because she is obviously not only doing her best to keep us all safe, but also working every day to make our lives better. So welcome, Monsurat. Thanks for being here. And I'll turn it over to Sunil to run the first panel.
Great. Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
So first off, just like to say thank you again to the organizers of the Incident Response Forum Masterclass for asking me to participate in this year's event. Really excited to moderate today's panel on the cyber threat landscape. So we're planning to cover the types of cyber threats that companies face, as well as how companies can prepare for them, and then if an incident happens, how to remediate them. John already did introductions for our panelists. I'm just really excited to have all of them on today's panel, all leading practitioners in the space, and more importantly, peers and friends, many of whom I've worked with before at incidents. So this is really exciting. Before we get started, I just want to note that we do welcome questions from the audience during the panel or at the end. So feel free to use the Q&A chat session. We'll try to cover the questions if they come up. Otherwise, we'll reserve them for the end. So now let's jump into the discussion. So as everybody knows, why you're here, cybersecurity is one of the most significant risks that companies, of course, face. One of the things we oftentimes hear is that the nature of the risks are changing. So, Craig, John had mentioned the breadth of incidents that you've worked on. I was wondering if you could give us an overview of the types of cyber threats that you see in your practice, and if you have any thoughts on the most common threats, or perhaps even the scariest threats. I'm sure our audience would appreciate hearing about that.
Yeah. So when I first started doing incident response, like a large catastrophic event would be a lost unencrypted backup tape. Fast forward to what we're seeing now. Our firm sees about 1,100 incidents a year. We track the underlying type of incident. Last year, about 50% were network intrusions. Then you go down to about 25% being email access events, and then a scattering of other things like inadvertent email, open cloud assets that someone finds and gets access to. If you go back and then start at network intrusion and the categories of what follows, if you look at what is the most common next step after someone gets into a network, 33% of the time our clients saw, after theft of data, some form of ransomware deployment. So if you look at what is the most prevalent, and especially if you layer in impact, ransomware events still are the most impactful. If you look at then the threat actors involved, what they're doing, I know Michael can talk about the nation state side, but if you stay mostly on either the groups that are doing this for financial reasons, or they're doing it because it's fun and they're interested in seeing what they can accomplish. But a lot of the methods and types of attacks, a lot of the ransomware events start with, especially in the past year, unpatched vulnerabilities in VPNs. Every firewall or VPN provider has gone through a round of our appliances are vulnerable, and that's an easy way in. And so the financially motivated ransomware groups are using a steady diet of either buying credentials that are available online or exploiting unpatched vulnerabilities in VPNs to get initial access. If you look at who I think are a little scarier, before you get to nation state, the groups a couple of years ago, Lapsus, they were using different tactics, including social engineering in different ways. if you layer in scattered spider as kind of an evolution of similar tactics and take, instead of people who are not in the US, take scattered spider, maybe or mostly individuals in the US who have really good language abilities, use SIM swapping and social engineering to get in, and then they're not exactly interested in money. They're interested in what they can accomplish, what kind of data they can steal that's interesting to them, or what kind of havoc they can wreak. Those are really scary attack methods where they just access your virtual environment and delete things, right? That causes immediate impact.
Great. Thanks, Craig. That, it is interesting though, when you talk about a lot of these groups being focused on money, but then there's some that aren't. Just wanted to drill down on that a little bit because you mentioned wreaking havoc. Like what type of havoc are you seeing people wreak aside from just sort of getting into your network and making work difficult?
And there are some groups, some ransomware groups that will use additional pressure tactics. Everyone starts with two: steal data, encrypt data to create two types of leverage. We've seen people have SWAT complaints coming in, like the threat actor said, I will notify the police department and say, this person's doing this thing if you don't pay my ransom. We've had people send flowers to security members, different ways to say, I know who you are, I'm watching you, you've had an event, now pay me. Like groups like Scattered Spider, even Lapsus, they just broke things in networks. They would steal things that were interesting to them, attack companies that were interesting to them, and while they were in there, just turn off things, disable things, or break them.
Got it. Now, you also mentioned nation state attacks. And so, Michael, I think you have a lot of experience with those. So can you tell us a little bit about how nation state attacks are different than maybe some of the types of attacks that Craig had mentioned?
You bet. Thanks. And a quick thank you to Bruce and John for running a great program as they always do, and Sunil for leading our session. And one thing I wanted to add to what Craig said is that what I've seen a lot of in the last year is not just ransomware, but the ransom part breaking off. And so many of the data thefts that I dealt with before now just have a ransom component. So it's not ransomware, there's no encryption going on, but there's a pay a ransom or we'll turn over your data. It's just so much more common. On the issue of nation states, I'll break down to three significant characteristics: motives, the resources available to nation states, and capabilities. And in incident response, knowing who your attacker is and knowing your attacker's objective is very, very helpful in understanding what sort of response you need to deploy. And so there's a very different response involved when the threat actor is stealing data for ransom or for identity theft, or if it's a nation state, and more generally when it's a nation state, information is being stolen for intelligence purposes, and it's either generally for the national security purposes of the attacking government, or for IP theft. So some governments are stealing vast amounts of US IP, sharing it with their industry. And so it's a very different response, particularly if consumer data is accessed. It doesn't change your notification obligations in the US, but it changes the threats and changes how you're addressing it and what the threats are to the company. In terms of resources, governments like Russia and China and others, they're not going to get tired. They're not going to go away if they want something. And so there's this acronym APT, Advanced Persistent Threat, that's used for these nation state actors. And the P part, the persistence, is what goes to these resources. And so the persistence means if they, for the criminals, they'll get tired and move on to someone else because there's so many different options out there. But if you're an intelligence target and a foreign government needs what you have, they're going to go after you again and again and again. And so persistence means that your alerting has to be better. Your strategy when it comes to a foreign state actor is not to keep them out. You try, but that's not going to be the objective. It's early detection and containment. No wide open doors. And the last thing are capabilities. Nation states have typically the best capabilities. So the most sophisticated techniques, use of 0 days, tools that will evade your tools. And overall, for nation state attacks, I think there's a much greater and a more urgent need for third-party vendor help. So companies that are experienced, have good resources internally, may be able to do a lot when it comes to criminal groups. But for nation states, it's a much more important opportunity to bring in a vendor, particularly because those vendors can develop intelligence and let you know more about who your attacker is and what it is they're trying to do.
Yeah, Michael, that's super interesting. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of how you deal with these types of threats and sort of how you get help. But you said something that was sort of interesting, which is that you focus on persistence. Yeah. How long do you see nation state actors, sort of carrying out their attack, versus maybe some of the other types of threats that we discussed earlier?
We had a client, and our government identified this sort of they were like a newish APT coming from somewhere in the Middle East, and for 18 months they would get in, get out, secure the network. There'd be a big fire drill, and then you're watching, and it could be weeks later, could be months later, and you don't know again if they have persistence in the network or not. But that's not atypical. If it's a mission critical piece for a particular government, then there are people who in that region of the world who are working 9 to 5, and you are their assignment. And so, and I don't know when you ever become secure in the fact that they're not coming back or they're done with you. So there's, I'm using persistence to talk about the persistence of the attack, but there has to be persistence in your alertness, and you're watching out for signs of the attack.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think we've often seen instances, at least in my practice, that these types of APT threats are sort of in companies for 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, before they are detected. And I think that sort of point about being persistent and vigilant in the detection, sort of attempts to detect them, is really important.
Add one.
Go ahead, Craig.
Some of the financially motivated groups have made enough money, they can afford to be persistent. If you look at like the group targeting SFTP applications, and some of the analysis from forensic firms is that they planned their last one for over 2 years, right? The one that led to lots of notices coming after May of 2023. A lot of analysis on how long they planned that effort.
Yeah, it's scary when you think about, some of these attacks are being planned for that long. Right? It almost seems like a military operation of sorts. Okay, I want to change gears a little bit and just focus on maybe a different type of threat. So, obviously AI is everywhere right now, in sort of every sort of context, how it's going to change our lives, maybe replace us, as lawyers and as practitioners. But before we go there, I want to, think about AI in the cyber threat context. So how do you guys, all of you, how do all of you see AI changing the threat landscape? I mean, is that already happening? Do you see it, or is it something that we should be aware of going forward?
Better social engineering, more effective phishing. We're seeing that now. More efficiencies in general, right? You deploy technologies, and the threat actor can do more, hit more people with greater precision, and operate at more scale. So I'll start with those points.
I think better scanning too, better scanning of social media, better scanning for personal data online, opportunities to make more sophisticated threats via text or via email, as Michael said, in terms of phishing emails, better coding, just sophistication all around.
I completely agree on the social engineering. We've seen it used to replicate voices and use that as a way to social engineer in. Haven't seen it as much yet in day-to-day. I think companies have enough issues that you don't have to be super sophisticated to find your way into a lot of companies, because there are enough open avenues. But I think as people lock down more, it will be used more as a way to find a way around the measures that get erected.
Okay. And so do you guys see that companies can even tell whether it's an AI-based threat or whether or AI-enhanced threat or just a sort of regular sort of threat? Does that even matter?
The only one to me where it was obvious was where the voice was spoofed, where you could tell they used publicly available samples to create the voice. Right? People will definitely say phishing emails are better than they have been.
Yeah, I'd say companies sometimes they know, but they're going to know less as time goes on because they, right now some of the AI isn't as good as it will get. So people don't often know. The thing that's important about detecting it is you can be, if you're socially engineered by a person, you often don't know. You're like, maybe that was someone, maybe it wasn't someone. But the minute you detect it's not a real voice or it's not a real person, I think triggers go off, red flags go off, and people will think something fishy is going on and will be more cautious in what they're doing.
I think one thing that I would just add is something that I think is really important to think about and talk about is cybersecurity and keeping that at the forefront of mind when going into AI technology development. We talk about secure by design all the time. It's not as often talked about when it comes to AI technologies, believe it or not. And so we need to bring the cybersecurity folks, we need to bring the data privacy folks in the room when the AI is being developed to incorporate those models into the AI development and technology in order to just get to the front of these issues before they start to get really pervasive.
Okay. So, I guess when you think about AI, right, and you want to, build these tools and have them sort of start thinking about AI more, going forward, I guess right now, are we still sort of in a more, human sort of defense posture? And is that going to shift more toward, having more AI defenses? Is that where you guys see things going?
Certainly could. I think the human piece is still going to be very important in the implementation. If AI helps you find ways to better exploit it on the company side, is if you pair it with detection of where you failed to implement effectively, right, it could be a way to counter.
Yeah. And AI is going to help on endpoint detection because the number of endpoints don't lend themselves to individual supervision and review.
Monsurat, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's a combination of both. I think it's, the idea of like what comes first, the chicken or the egg. I think it's going to keep feeding in cyclical, right? Like it's going to be like the humans feed into the technology is going to feed into the human sort of development of the technology. The more data we have, the more we're inputting into the technology, and it's just going to keep going round and round. So the more sophisticated the technology becomes, the more sophisticated the humans become in developing the technology. So I think we're going to have to be aware on both sides. Because I think we're going to see a combination of both human and technological pervasiveness in terms of cyber threats.
Great. So, we've been talking a lot about the threats to corporate networks, but, corporate networks aren't everything. What about, attacks, I guess, in other contexts? So, should we be worried about, cyber attacks and maybe AI-enhanced cyber attacks and threats on infrastructure or cars or planes or trains? Monsurat, I was hoping you could maybe start with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything that Craig and Michael were saying, it pertains to critical infrastructure as well. Here at CISA, our focus are 16 critical infrastructure areas in particular. But in addition to data theft and ransomware, which is extremely pervasive, especially in like the K through 12 area and the municipalities, we're also thinking about things like service disruption. That's really big if you're thinking about things like water and wastewater or the power grids, right? If there's service disruption to our power supply or our water supply, that could be detrimental and it could actually be harmful to a lot of people. So we're constantly thinking in terms of healthcare, in terms of electricity, in terms of water, in terms of chemical supply chains, including, so even with, you mentioned transportation, planes, trains, cars, we're definitely thinking about things like remote hijacking, exploited vulnerabilities. A lot of the work that we do is trying to figure out the way these threat actors come in and how we can prevent against those things. Signal interference is another thing that we're concerned about. We had a really big concern recently with a particular, I don't know if I'm able to talk too much about it. We're still sort of in the middle of it, but huge disruption issues that were happening, and it required all hands on deck, where we're trying to reach out to all of these critical infrastructure service agencies to ensure that they have the tools that they need to support against these threats. So yeah, it's some of the similar things to the corporate sector, but I would say we're thinking about it on a larger scale when it comes to critical infrastructure.
Got it. And obviously, critical infrastructure covers a wide range of, areas. And I think, a couple of years ago, with a very highly publicized incident at Colonial Pipeline, within critical infrastructure, is anything that's maybe more critical or sort of more sort of sensitive right now?
I think it depends on the circumstance and the situation, because I wouldn't say that healthcare is less or more important than wastewater. If you think about chemicals getting in your wastewater, that could be detrimental just as much as it could be in terms of hospitals not having the ability to provide critical support to millions of people, right? So I wouldn't say that one is more important. I would say that it's really important for us to keep our eye on all of the 16 areas that we're focusing on, and even more, and particularly how they're connected to each other, because no system is isolated. And so we're constantly trying to determine the connection points and reaching out to agencies and organizations to prevent the disruption from happening before it happens. And so there's a lot to think about when it comes to those kinds of things.
Well, that's a good segue into our next area. You'd mentioned, how to start thinking about preventing these types of incidents. So, preparation and trying to prevent these things is sort of a huge part of what companies have sort of been switching to in the last, several years. So I wanted to talk to the group, have you guys explain maybe some of the best practices for preparing for a cyber attack. So, Michael, can you maybe start us off on that topic?
Yeah, so I think table stakes in this discussion is incident response plans. Everybody has to have one. Depending on your size and what you do, the scope of your plan can vary. Everyone has to have an incident response plan. And here are the characteristics of what a good, solid incident response plan is for everyone. More than any policy or procedure document you have, it has to be usable and practical. Like it's not a policy. It's a manual for you to use. Have it in one place. When I speak to a client and they say, we have an incident response plan, we have this document and that document, and Harry knows this and Sally knows that, it's a bad plan. You have to have it all in one place. It's one of the few things I tell clients, print it out and have a hard copy. Because when the network goes down and you don't have access to your incident response plan, it's like that fire in the firehouse kind of thing. It's a key bit of preparation. I also find that people take notes in them throughout the year. So when you update your plan, you've sort of got all your stuff there. And then the two key components of a plan are, number one, the triage part of your plan. How do incidents come in? How do events come in? All sorts of things happen. When they happen, you don't know what they are. It's an alert. And so how do they come in? How are they assessed and triaged? And then most plans will put incidents or events into one of typically 4 tiers, right? From critical to high, medium, and low. And so how in your environment do you make those determinations about tiers? And then what happens in each tier? Who's notified? What actions do you take? Do you notify your insurer? Do you reach out to the FBI? Like what goes on? That needs to be a well-oiled machine. That's the guts of what your incident response plan is doing in the first instant. And then the second part, critical part of an incident response plan, are gathering all the resources that you're going to need into one place. The less you have to figure out when you have the incident, the better, and to the greater extent it'll reduce legal risk. So who is on your team? Does everyone know their responsibilities? What are all the outside resources you could possibly use? Do you have a crisis communications firm that you would use? If you need to pay ransom, who are you going to use for ransom? On and on. There's so many resources. And now, meaning before you have the breach, is the time to have that plan, figure out who all those people are, and talk to people you know in the industry. Talk to a peer at another company, talk to a lawyer, talk to someone and say, hey, what are all the categories that you fill out, and who do you need in it? And the last thing a good plan needs is an agenda for your first meeting. Like, just list out all those things so that someone's not saying, oh, what am I missing? What am I forgetting? When you get that news, and it could be at night, it could be on the weekend, there are a lot of things to think about. Get that in the plan. And so a really practical, useful, helpful incident response plan is the first step in having an effective response.
Michael, I love that you said right from the beginning, usable and practical.
Yeah.
I always find that that's like the biggest issue, is that, a lot of times people have these plans that, then you go read it and nobody really knows what they're doing. And there's maybe language in there that people just don't really know what to do with. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about situations that maybe, or plans you've seen that are not as usable and practical? Like, what are the sort of mistakes that companies make in that regard?
I mean, they a couple of things. Sometimes they'll be combining like a policy statement. So it's a long, I've seen like purpose of this plan can be like 2 days on two things on the purpose of the plan, and just lots of things that your eyes glaze over and you don't want to read. You just want useful information. So less can be more. Less descriptions about all these things. Put them somewhere else. It's not an educational piece per se. It's a tool, and I think it's tailor-made for a particular kind of tabletop exercise. I've seen and participated in tabletop exercises with companies that run through the life of an event. And some of them can bring in outside actors and fake news stories and all that. And I think that what's most helpful, particularly from the start, is to have a tabletop exercise that runs through 4 or 5 different scenarios for the team and the leaders, so that people see that first part, like something comes up, this is what we'll do, this is who gets notified. And it allows someone in the leadership to say, well, hey, how come I'm not notified? Great, you're on the list. Or how come we're not doing this or that? Like, get those mechanics down, make it useful in that way, in that way. And so it's really a practical how-to manual. And there are other components. I don't want to give short shrift to other pieces, and NIST outlines sort of the different components that need to be in it, but really practical and useful. And it is when people, I know it is when I see a client and I see like a ratty, I'll be in someone's office and I see this thing printed out, looks like it was printed out 6 years ago, and it's ratty and dirty and has food and coffee stains on it, and it's being written over all the time. So you want it to be someone's friend, I guess, in bad times. But really, you want it to be a really useful resource, and updated every year. So the people that are using it are taking notes in it, learning from every incident, and then updating it with more useful information from particular things that came up, questions that weren't able to be immediately answered.
I'd love to add to that, if I may. Just what you asked, what are some of the issues or concerns that we see coming up? And I will say that, a lot of people are intimidated when it comes to incident response. They don't know where to begin, and a lot of folks are downloading templates from online and they're not tailoring it. And I find that that's hugely problematic. So thinking about the things that Michael said, scope, really understanding like who, what, how, when, things like that, it really needs to be spelled out and not have all of this general language that came off of a template that someone got from another organization or online. I think that's critical. I think that having everyone who needs to be in it should be in it. I find that in some incident response plans, a lot of people are missing. People still think that incident response and cybersecurity are IT only. That's not the case. People aren't thinking about PR. When do we notify people? Who do we notify? Having particular relationships in place in advance and having the contact information, or having updated contact information, making sure it's not outdated. Things like that, I think, are really, really key. And And the last thing I'll say is just keeping it updated, as Michael said, because you'll find that people, especially in the public sector, I'm speaking about more specifically, people come and go, right? So the person who was in the role maybe 2 years ago isn't there anymore. And so now you don't have a contact person. So just making sure that somebody has their eyes on the incident response plan on the regular so that it can be updated as people come and go.
Got it. That makes sense. We're talking about preparation for an incident. And so, you have this plan so that everybody knows what they're supposed to do in the event of an incident. But there's also a lot you have to do on sort of the technical side and, to prevent the incident from happening in the first place. Hopefully it doesn't. And then if it does, once you have to respond to it, there's a lot of other considerations, to mitigate risk and sort of address, legal obligations. So, there's sort of other aspects of this too. So Craig, can you maybe talk about some of those other aspects, the technical and sort of legal aspects of the response?
Yes, and I think it's ideal if you can do these and you don't have an incident, or you do these, you still have an incident, but you can explain it occurred despite our efforts. And I think generally, if you look at regulatory expectations, if you look at some of the new laws, it starts with a risk assessment. And I don't mean like a 1,000-row Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of risks that people go through, yes or no, it could affect us, that no one does anything with. And I think whether it's intended or unintended from the SEC, one of the outcomes of the SEC cyber rule is that you have executives now, especially as companies mature their risk assessment process, looking at the analysis and the output. What are the areas of residual risk that you categorize as medium or high? And then say, is this something we want to accept, or is this something we want to change and do something about? And it's not enough to just rattle off, this is the list of tools we have, but I think there are a lot of baseline expectations on tools, right? If you can't say we have EDR, MDR, XDR, IAM, PAM, SIM, SOAR, MFA, people are going to look at you and say, well, you're missing the basics. And so that's half the battle. The risk assessment should look at who is coming after you, who are the people likely to come after you, what are their methods, and for those things that are impactful, what are the measures that are effective at addressing those attempts? And then, or you can look at your peers who've had those issues, what are the controls we should have in place to address those? About 25% of the incidents our clients see are vendor caused. So if you're just looking in your network, you're missing a significant amount of underlying issues for yourself. So a vendor management plan with basically 3 parts. How do you do effective diligence to pick a good vendor? How do you have the right contractual protections? How do you oversee the vendor during the life of that vendor providing services to you? So another key area. And then you can have the best tools, but if you implement your MFA solution and there's a bypass option and people use the bypass option, right? It's amazing that there are options like that in important security tools, but there are. And so the implementation part, right? If you're basing all of your security program on segmentation and you're not actually segmented, right? An internal pen test finds that helps you reevaluate how you need to build your security program.
Yeah, Greg, super helpful. You talked about sort of planning. I guess the other side of this is sort of, maybe thinking about relationships with the government. Obviously, CISA is an important part of that aspect. So, Monsurat, can you talk about how companies are sort of establishing relations with the government and what companies can sort of expect or how they can expect to benefit from that?
Absolutely. So unfortunately, sometimes it's through an incident, right? An incident occurs, and then that's when people are like, where do we go? Who do we talk to? What resources are available? And so that's when they come to us. And our hope is that we can create relationships in advance of an incident occurring. We do a lot of outreach. We do a lot of workshops. We do a lot of trainings. We have a lot of conversations. We have CSAs and PSAs in every state. That's a protective security advisor and cybersecurity advisor. In some states, we have more than one. We do start with the risk assessment. So we go out and we're having conversations with folks who are interested to just figure out what their assets are. A lot of folks, believe it or not, aren't fully aware of all of their assets. And so it first starts with asset inventory and then understanding where your risks are, right? We have a lot of conversations about IT and OT. What's the difference between information technology and operational technology? And is there someone responsible for operational technology that's separate from the information technology person? And are they having conversations, and so on and so forth? So I say that to say that we do a lot of outreach. We have a lot of conversations to try to be preemptive as opposed to waiting for an incident to happen. I will say that one thing that we've been doing a lot lately are something called vulnerability notifications and pre-ransomware notifications. It's a lot of cold calling, believe it or not. So when we get third-party information that informs us that, you know, there's a vulnerability on a particular system or there's an attacker in a particular system, you know, we're trying to reach out to say, hey, we noticed that something's going on with your system. How can we help? How can we support you? How can we put you in contact with the FBI and other agencies? A lot of it is information about what we do versus what the FBI does versus other federal agencies. We're not just yet a regulatory agency, right? So we function a little bit differently than some of the other agencies. So I think it's important to know what resources are out there and then to take advantage of the federal resources that that you need at any given time.
So, Monsurat, there was a question from the audience that I wanted to flag. I think maybe we can start with you on this, but you know, how do companies sort of plan for geopolitical changes that could have a security impact? You know, such as China invading Taiwan. You know, what should companies be doing, you know, to sort of plan for those risks?
That's a great question. I would say that first and foremost, if you're not subscribed to any sort of advisories or alerts, whether that be our alerts on our website or other alerts or advisories, you should absolutely first and foremost be subscribed, whether it's the MSI-SAC, whether it's CISA, FBI, whether it's your local fusion center, whatever it is, it's important to just know what's going on before it happens, right? And so there's a lot of free services and even some that are paid services that will just inform you of where to go and what's going on and what to do to prevent some of these attacks from happening that we know are coming up. The other thing is, and I know, you know, we're still in a space where people are very reluctant to share information, but we find that information sharing is key. We try to work with different agencies to really understand what threats are out there so that we can get the information out there to the public. So if any organization, company, entity is aware of a threat, they should, we have on our website, they should let us know, right? Because it's all private, that you know, it's not specifically ascribed to you as an organization, but the more that we know, the more that we're informed, we can get that information out there to everybody. And the same for you, right? Like that's how we were able to do the pre-ransomware notifications and other things like that. It's by being informed. So I would say, in addition to many other steps and tools, first and foremost, make sure that you're subscribed to alerts and advisories.
Well, Monsurat, another question for you from the audience. You know, when should a company reach out to CISA versus the FBI? Can you give, you know, some guidance on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Not enough people ask that question. I'm so glad that question came up. So the FBI is really there for investigatory purposes. They're trying to hunt down the criminal actor, right? So their purpose is to really do research in order to bring the company or the person to justice, right? And to some extent, help you mitigate some of the damage on your system, if at all possible. CISA, that's not our role at all. So our role is really to, one, help you gather information so that we can figure out how to help harden your systems or improve your systems or put things in place so that we can protect you. The other thing we're known for is putting you in touch with the right folks. So whether that's at the local level, whether that's at the federal level, because we're such a joint operational organization, we're in touch with all of the folks, both local and at the federal level, to provide you with the resources that you need in order to help you not only prevent further damage to your system, but to figure out who you can call in terms of investigations, in terms of, so for example, we have a relationship in Massachusetts with the local fusion center where you have access to Shodan scans, where you have access to local support, where you have access to the FBI federal support, so that you're not going through it alone. And then the other thing too, the other benefit of reaching out to CISA is that We can advise you, or I shouldn't say that as a lawyer, I shouldn't say that. We can't advise you specifically. We can't make actual recommendations, but we can provide support in terms of helping you know where to go and when to go there. So as soon as an organization or an entity is hit, sometimes they'll call us and we'll do the connection points to the FBI and all of the other folks that they need to be in contact with, so that they can start to investigate and mitigate the damage on their systems. I hope that was an answer to the question.
Yeah, I think that was great. Thank you. So we only have a few minutes left. I want to make sure we cover our last topic, which is remediation. So, when the incident actually happens, now you have to go and deal with it and fix it. So, can our panelists talk a little bit about how remediation efforts vary from incident to incident, given all the different types of threats that, companies face?
Well, I'd say that one thing is that they all start the same way, which is to find out what's going on and stop the bleeding. Before you sort of respond to what went on, you want to mitigate the DDoS attack, unlock your systems if they're encrypted, find out who's in your system, and get them out of your system. That's always step one, and that's never changed.
There are firms that specialize in helping you assess what occurred and coming up with workarounds, new measures, new controls to restore what was affected by the incident. And I think it's convincing the internal security team. They will know enough about your network and be able to help you quickly. You're not going to have to hold their hand. You're going to get 5 people showing up, and after a day, you're going to say, can you send 5 more because you're so helpful. There are third parties who are really good at helping companies accelerate the pace of recovery.
I would just add, know what your resources are, know how much you can allocate towards incident response, and be ready to go. Because if you're thinking about it when the incident is actually happening, it makes it difficult to remediate. So understand, in addition to roles and responsibilities, understand what you can have access to and what you still need access to in terms of your resource capabilities.
Got it. And so when you think about remediation, whether you're using, different firms or not, to help with that, what do you think are the common pitfalls that you see when companies are actually trying to remediate a cyber attack?
I'll start with 2. Companies that don't know what data they have and don't know their systems is a huge pitfall, right? Like, hey, we've had an intrusion, they've stolen a bunch of data. What do you have? I don't really know. Big pitfall. And then to what Craig was saying before, some clients, and we love our clients, but some of them, it takes a lot of convincing that they need help. They think they can do it. They've got a team. You go through cycles of just not getting there, and it's a common pitfall, and it really can cost the company in terms of response, capturing evidence, and that's I don't know, Craig, the non-lawyering, the socializing part of the game, as to like, your people are terrific at what they do, and bringing someone in doesn't mean that they're not. Or the other part is money, right? Like bringing in, it's very easy for us to say, bring in this vendor, bring in that vendor. Insurance may not cover it. It could be expensive, and so a company very legitimately is looking to not take on big costs. And sometimes we know this is a case where the company needs to spend that money. And so it can take a while to do that. And so I think that's a sort of common pitfall. And I think when I'll speak for Craig, someone calls us and says, hey, new client, they sort of have a breach. Like, the most important thing you're figuring out immediately is like, what kind of company is this? Where are they in their sophistication? How quickly are they going to be able to act, or how much socializing is going to be required?
I'll just add to that. I'll say, so if you don't have a lot of resources, there are a lot of free or accessible resources out there, and they're being tiered. And there's a lot of resources that will even break down, what's like highly expensive, what's low cost, things like that. So there is an opportunity, whatever your risk level is when it comes to cost. There are resources out there. I would say other things that people aren't thinking about. You can't secure everything on the cloud. Everybody's just like, we'll put everything on the cloud and then it's secure. That's not how it works. And so definitely think about that. And the other thing I would add is inadequate communication across teams and inadequate backups. I think those are things that people really need to be thinking about, that they're not necessarily paying enough attention to when it comes to remediation.
One hand to forehead moment, deleting encrypted systems because you're running out of space while you're restoring, only to find out you wish you had that encrypted version back to use a decryptor on later.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So we're just about out of time. If you guys have 20 seconds each, maybe I would really appreciate it. I think if you could give maybe the group, our audience here, maybe one brief key takeaway that they should walk away from this panel with.
I'll start with a really specific one. Everyone's in the cloud now, as they should be, and just because you're using AWS or Office 365 or Azure doesn't mean you're in great shape if you are not configured properly. And there are people, we talk about vendors, there are people, I know them, we know them, who, this fella came from Microsoft and spent his whole career working on Office 365, and for 2 or 3 hours at couple $100 an hour, right? He can come in and look at what you're doing and help your configurations, because we come in after an incident, and again, you're using the cloud service. It doesn't mean that you've got the logging that you need. You've retained what you have, and that's not, unless you have the particular service level, that's not for the cloud provider to do. It's a really inexpensive, really important thing for people to do. And again, so don't have a false sense of security that you're in the cloud. Make sure your cloud configurations are done right. Your in-house person typically won't be the best person to do it. It's a really sophisticated kind of thing. Bring someone in to do it quickly. It'll really pay off in the future.
Yeah. Go ahead, Monsurat.
Go ahead, Greg.
Well, because of the cloud, right, identity access and management is the new endpoint. Right? AV didn't work, so you needed to move to EDR. We see ransomware events where they use no malware to get from initial access to the point where they deploy their ransomware binary, because they're just using credentials and legitimate system tools. So managing access, secure configuration is the new equivalent of having EDR as a distinction.
I want to say just a couple things. One, having top-down support is really important. It's not enough for it to just be on the CISO or on the IT team to really figure out security. There needs to be a culture of security. And so there needs to be regular training for all employees. That's the way that you really protect against cyber threats. Everyone has a stake, and they should understand that. And then having everyone think proactively instead of reactively when it comes to cybersecurity and data privacy. I think that's also key.